In the summer of 1938, the U.S. Navy graduated a quiet Georgian with a ready smile and an engineer's mind from its flight training program at Pensacola. David McCampbell was not the loudest or most flamboyant of his classmates, but he had the habits that naval aviation demanded most: precision, patience, and relentless discipline. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, these qualities would carry him from a junior pilot to the most celebrated air group commander in the Navy. But in 1938, he was just another young man strapping himself into the cockpit of an aging biplane trainer, trying to master the balance between speed, altitude, and the unforgiving surface of the sea. McCampbell's early naval career reflected the interwar years of American aviation itself: modest, experimental, and underfunded, but steadily gaining sophistication. The U.S. Navy had embraced aircraft carriers in theory, yet only 2 were operational when McCampbell began training. To be a naval aviator then was to gamble on a branch of warfare that was still proving itself. McCampbell embraced that gamble, and within months earned the coveted wings of gold. His first operational assignments were not glamorous. He flew scout and observation planes, learning navigation over water, carrier landings in rough seas, and the art of gunnery. The discipline of naval flying was relentless. Approach patterns drilled endlessly, checklists memorized to the letter, the habit of precise radio communication enforced by senior officers who brooked no sloppiness. McCampbell thrived in this environment. Fellow aviators later recalled his ability to remain calm under pressure, to listen carefully before giving instruction, and to repeat complex procedures until every detail was exact. By 1941, as war drew closer, the Navy accelerated its expansion. McCampbell was posted to the newly commissioned carrier USS Wasp CV-7. Wasp was smaller than the Yorktown or Essex class carriers that would dominate later in the war, but she carried nearly 80 aircraft and a tightly knit air group. McCampbell flew fighters and absorbed the rhythms of carrier operations at sea. Long hours on alert, brief minutes of high tension during launches and recoveries, and the constant awareness that a flat-topped ship in mid-ocean was both powerful and vulnerable. That vulnerability became all too real on September 15, 1942. While escorting reinforcements to Guadalcanal, USS Wasp was struck by 3 torpedoes fired by the Japanese submarine by 19. Fires and explosions tore through the carrier. McCampbell was below deck when the blasts hit, and only barely escaped the inferno. Within hours, the ship was abandoned and scuttled, taking 193 sailors and nearly all of her aircraft to the bottom. For McCampbell, survival was both personal luck and professional lesson. Carriers could vanish in minutes, and airmen had to be ready to continue the fight from whatever deck remained afloat. Transferred back to the United States after Wasp's loss, McCampbell was given new responsibilities. By 1943, he was promoted to commander of Carrier Air Group 15, soon to be embarked on USS Essex. Known later as the fabled 15, this collection of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers would become one of the most successful naval air groups of the war. McCampbell's appointment was unusual. Few men who had not yet made their name in combat were given command of an entire air group, but senior officers recognized in him a rare balance: strict discipline matched with a temperament that inspired confidence rather than fear. The timing of his promotion coincided with a revolution in American naval aviation. The Grumman F6F Wildcat, the stubby little fighter that had borne the brunt of the early Pacific battles, was being phased out. In its place came the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine built for dominance. Bigger, faster, heavier armed, the Hellcat was designed to overcome the 0 on every count except perhaps turn radius. With 6.50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plate, it could give as well as it took. McCampbell understood immediately what the Hellcat meant. The Wildcat had been a defensive fighter, holding the line with courage but always fighting uphill against Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat, by contrast, was an offensive weapon, a carrier-based machine that could seize and keep the initiative. "This is the airplane that will carry us to Japan," McCampbell reportedly told his men during the first briefings on the new fighter. The transition was not automatic. Pilots had to learn to manage more horsepower, heavier controls, and the temptation to waste ammunition from 6 blazing guns. McCampbell drilled his squadron constantly. He insisted on deflection shooting practice, leading a target correctly rather than spraying bullets. He demanded fuel discipline, exact approach procedures, and teamwork in formations. The result was a cadre of aviators who respected his authority and trusted his judgment implicitly. Discipline in McCampbell's hands was never arbitrary. He rarely raised his voice, but when he corrected a pilot, he did so with precision. One junior aviator later remembered, "He'd walk you through your mistakes until you saw them yourself." By the end, you wanted to do better, not because you feared him, but because you didn't want to let him down. This leadership style became crucial as Air Group 15 prepared for its first major deployment in 1944. By the time the Essex and her air group sailed into the Central Pacific, McCampbell was both mentor and commander, teaching rookies how to survive their first combat and reminding veterans that discipline, not bravado, won battles. His calm demeanor hid a fierce determination. He knew the stakes. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing one last attempt to contest American carrier supremacy. The Marianas Campaign would bring the fleets into direct confrontation. For McCampbell, it was the culmination of everything he had trained for, a chance to lead men and machine into the largest carrier battle in history. What set McCampbell apart, even before his first great victories, was not merely skill in the cockpit, but the recognition that naval aviation was a system. Planes were nothing without carriers, pilots were nothing without discipline, and battles were won not by single duels, but by coordinated effort. His role as Air Group Commander required him to think beyond individual combat, to plan strike packages, coordinate fighters with bombers, and integrate radar reports with launch schedules. He embraced this complexity with the same patience he had shown as a young trainee in Pensacola. Thus, when Air Group 15 took to the skies over the Philippine Sea in June 1944, its commander was already a legend in the making. McCampbell had survived fire and water on Wasp, mastered the most powerful naval fighter yet built, and shaped a team of aviators whose discipline and confidence reflected his own. The Hellcat had entered the Pacific, and David McCampbell was ready to write his chapter in its history. The Pacific skies of 1942 had been a proving ground for courage, not machines. In the hands of Navy and Marine pilots, the stubby Grumman F4F Wildcat had fought the Mitsubishi A6M0 to a standstill at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Yet every pilot knew the truth. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and could climb with alarming agility. Only superior tactics and the willingness to sacrifice had prevented disaster. By 1943, the United States demanded something more than a defensive fighter. It needed a weapon that could seize the initiative and dominate the skies over the Pacific. That answer came in the form of the F6F Hellcat, a machine so perfectly matched to the war it entered that it reshaped the balance of aerial combat. When David McCampbell took command of Air Group 15, he inherited not only men but also this remarkable new aircraft, a weapon whose strengths fit his leadership style with uncanny precision. First flown in 1942 and deployed to the fleet in 1943, the Hellcat was the culmination of Grumman's philosophy of building fighters for survival as much as victory. Unlike the elegant Zero, designed for agility at the cost of armour, the Hellcat was a brute: large fuselage, broad wings, and 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, delivered 2,000 horsepower, propelling the Hellcat to 380 miles per hour, not the fastest fighter in the world, but fast enough to meet and beat the Zero in nearly every respect. It was not speed alone that made the Hellcat revolutionary. It was survivability. Armor plate behind the pilot, bulletproof glass in front, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged construction meant that Hellcats brought their pilots home even when riddled with holes. Where a Zero might burst into flame from a single hit, Hellcats limped back to their carriers, patched up, and returned to the fight. The psychological effect was profound. American pilots now believed they could fight aggressively, take hits, and live to fly again. The Hellcat's impact in the Pacific was mirrored by the arrival of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning in Europe and the Mediterranean. The twin-boom Lightning, with its turbo superchargers and heavy armament, gave the U.S. Army Air Forces the long-range punch it needed to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Like the Hellcat, the P-38 marked a transition from barely adequate stopgap designs to machines purpose-built for dominance. But while the Lightning fought Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over Europe, the Hellcat's domain was the island chains of the Pacific. Its task was unique: wrest control of the skies from an enemy whose doctrine prized maneuverability and who believed the Zero's reputation unassailable. In that theatre, the Hellcat did not merely compete, it annihilated. Between 1943 and 1945, American factories built 12,275 Hellcats, a number almost beyond comprehension for Japanese planners who struggled to keep a fraction of their pre-war aircraft production alive. The Hellcat achieved 5,223 aerial victories in the Pacific, against only 270 losses in air-to-air combat. That is a kill ratio of 19-1, one of the most lopsided records in aviation history. The statistics told only part of the story. More than 300 Navy and Marine aces scored their victories in Hellcats. Carrier decks that had once hosted squadrons of Wildcats now launched divisions of Hellcats capable of sweeping Japanese skies clean before dive bombers and torpedo planes struck their targets. The aircraft was not merely effective, it was decisive. The genius of the Hellcat lay not in futuristic technology, but in practical design choices. The wings folded easily for carrier storage. The wide landing gear reduced the risk of crash landings on pitching decks. The cockpit offered excellent visibility, vital for spotting enemies in a three-dimensional sky. Maintenance crews loved it. The aircraft was simple to service, forgiving of damage, and built with the ruggedness that made Grumman aircraft famous among Navy men as Iron Works products. Its firepower was unmatched in the Pacific. 6 Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, each with 400 rounds of ammunition, could shred a bomber or fighter in seconds. Japanese aircraft, lightly built and often unarmored, disintegrated under such punishment. Even pilots who missed with half their burst could still cripple an opponent. Most importantly, the Hellcat neutralized the Zero's advantages. In a dive, the Hellcat accelerated faster. In a roll, its heavier frame carried momentum the Zero could not match. At high speeds, the Zero's controls stiffened while the Hellcat remained responsive. Where the Zero could once dictate the terms of combat, the Hellcat now seized that initiative. For David McCampbell, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a test of discipline. He knew that overwhelming firepower was a double-edged sword. A pilot could empty his ammunition in a few wild bursts and be left helpless. McCampbell emphasized the art of marksmanship. Deflection shooting, firing not where the enemy was but where he would be, became his obsession. He trained his men to fire in controlled bursts, to conserve ammunition, and to place shots with precision. "Don't spray," he told his squadron. "Make every round count. You don't win by wasting bullets. You win by hitting the cockpit, the engine, the wing root." Pilots later recalled that McCampbell's briefings often included sketches of Japanese aircraft, showing where fire would do the most damage. He approached gunnery with an engineer's exactness and a hunter's patience. This discipline paid off spectacularly. McCampbell himself would go on to record 34 aerial victories, making him the Navy's all-time leading ace. Many of these came in single-engagement bursts of lethal efficiency, where his accuracy allowed him to down multiple aircraft without exhausting his guns. His philosophy was clear. In the Hellcat, quantity of fire mattered less than quality of aim. By late 1943, the impact of the Hellcat was already evident. At Marcus Island, Wake, and the Marshalls, Hellcats swept enemy aircraft aside with ruthless efficiency. Japanese pilots, who had once enjoyed near-mythical status, found themselves hunted by swarms of blue-painted fighters that absorbed punishment, struck back with devastating firepower, and returned again the next day. For McCampbell and his men, the Hellcat was not just an aircraft, but a symbol of industrial and tactical ascendancy. Where Japan could replace neither its lost pilots nor its outdated aircraft, America produced Hellcats by the thousand, delivering them to carrier decks across the Pacific. Each new engagement widened the gulf. The revolution was not dramatic in the sense of new technology or radical innovation. It was a revolution of balance, an aircraft that combined ruggedness, firepower, and survivability in exactly the right measure, piloted by men trained in discipline and teamwork. The Hellcat turned the Pacific into an American hunting ground, and under McCampbell's leadership, Air Group 15 became its most skilled predator. By the summer of 1944, when the Japanese committed their remaining carriers and air power to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the outcome was already foretold. Hellcats, flown by disciplined pilots and led by commanders like McCampbell, would tear apart the last strength of Japanese naval aviation. The revolution begun in 1943 would reach its decisive climax in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the spring of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point. The long, grinding campaigns through the Solomons and New Guinea had sapped Japanese strength and brought American forces closer to the enemy's inner defense line. Yet the question remained, where to strike next? Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, had long favored a Central Pacific drive, seizing island groups that would shorten the path to Japan and place American air power within striking range of the home islands themselves. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, agreed. The Marianas became the chosen target. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not simply dots on the map. They were stepping stones of immense strategic weight. From airfields in the Marianas, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo and the industrial heart of Japan. Their seizure would cut Japan's vital supply lines to the south and place American forces within the enemy's defensive ring. The Japanese themselves understood this all too well. As one post-war Japanese officer put it, "When we lost Saipan, we lost the war." But to seize the Marianas meant confronting the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, what remained of it after the disastrous attrition of 1942 and 1943. Japan could not allow the Marianas to fall without a fight, and so both sides prepared for a decisive confrontation. In Tokyo, Admiral Minechi Koga had planned a final decisive battle under the name Operation A-Go. After his death in a plane crash in March 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda took command of the combined fleet and adopted the plan. Its core idea was simple: lure the Americans into a great fleet battle near the Marianas, strike them with massed carrier air power, and restore Japanese control of the Pacific. The fleet assembled for this purpose was impressive on paper. It included the giant battleship Yamato, the most powerful ever built, and a carrier force of 9 ships. Among them were the veteran Zuikaku and Shokaku, survivors of Coral Sea, and the brand-new Taiho, Japan's first armoured deck carrier. Altogether, Japan mustered some 430 carrier aircraft, supported by hundreds more land-based planes stationed on the Marianas and nearby islands. To Japanese planners, this seemed a force capable of turning the tide. Yet beneath the surface lay weakness. Many of the carrier air groups were filled with hastily trained pilots, their experience far inferior to the hardened American aviators who had fought since Guadalcanal. Aircraft production lagged, oil supplies were strained, and unlike 1942, the Americans now had overwhelming superiority in radar, logistics, and replacement capability. The AGO plan was less a calculated strategy than a desperate gamble. Opposing this was the most formidable naval armada ever assembled. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, carried the burden of the Central Pacific Drive. Spruance, cerebral and cautious, was known for his ability to weigh risks with icy precision. His striking arm was Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mitcher, a flyer himself, understood carrier operations intimately. Under his direction, Task Force 58 had become a finely tuned machine of massed air power. By June 1944, Task Force 58 consisted of 15 carriers, 7 heavy Essex class, 8 light Independence class, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and an immense train of supply ships. Together, they carried over 900 aircraft. This was naval air power on a scale the Japanese could not match. On board the USS Essex CV-9, David McCampbell prepared Air Group 15 for battle. The fabled 15 was a balanced striking force, Hellcats for air superiority, Helldivers for dive bombing, Avengers for torpedo attacks. McCampbell drilled his men relentlessly in gunnery, formation flying, and fuel discipline. He knew the stakes. This was no longer a war of attrition in the Solomons. This would be a climactic battle in open ocean, where the future of the Pacific campaign might be decided in a single engagement. If the Americans carried overwhelming strength in ships and planes, they also possessed a decisive advantage in intelligence. The codebreakers of Ultra had penetrated Japanese naval communications. By early June, decrypts revealed that Operation AGO was in motion and that the Japanese fleet was concentrating for battle in the Philippine Sea. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the movements. Spruance and Mitcher knew almost exactly when and where the Japanese would come. This knowledge shaped the American approach. Rather than rush into the teeth of Japanese defences, Spruance positioned his fleet to cover the invasion forces landing on Saipan. He would force the Japanese to come to him. Mitcher, eager for an aggressive pursuit, sometimes chafed at this restraint, but Spruance's caution proved wise. By holding the line near the Marianas, the Americans could shield their transports and simultaneously engage the enemy under favourable conditions. In the ready rooms of Task Force 58's carriers, anticipation mixed with nerves. Pilots knew that a vast enemy fleet was approaching. Some had fought at Midway or Guadalcanal. Others were about to see combat for the first time. McCampbell kept his air group focused on fundamentals: formation integrity, disciplined gunnery, communication. He reminded them that radar and fleet coordination would provide early warning. He reassured them with his quiet confidence. The Hellcats on Essex's deck gleamed in their blue-grey paint, lined in neat rows. Their pilots carried with them not only the lessons of McCampbell's training, but also the weight of expectation. In the coming days, they would face the largest carrier battle in history. The Japanese planned to break American strength in one crushing blow. The Americans intended to prove that the era of the Zero was over, that the Hellcat and its pilots now ruled the skies. As the Japanese fleet steamed eastward from the Philippines, the stage was set. On June 13th, U.S. forces began the invasion of Saipan. Japanese land-based aircraft struck furiously, but were beaten back by Task Force 58's combat air patrols. On June 15th, Ultra intercepts confirmed that Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, was approaching with his carriers. For McCampbell and Air Group 15, the moment was at hand. The long months of training, the endless drills in gunnery and discipline, the lessons drawn from the loss of USS Wasp, all converged in this moment. Soon they would launch into the vast sky of the Philippine Sea, where history would record the clash not only of fleets but of entire strategies. The Marianas were more than islands. They were the gateway to Japan, the fulcrum of Pacific strategy. Both sides knew it. Both sides gambled everything. For the Americans, confidence rested on numbers, technology, and preparation. For the Japanese, hope rested on courage and the fading aura of the Zero. When the two fleets met, the outcome would be nothing less than the death knell of Japanese naval air power. And at the center of the American response, leading from the cockpit of his Hellcat, was Commander David McCampbell, calm, disciplined, and ready to carve his name into the annals of naval history. At dawn on June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea stretched calm and endless. Beneath its surface steamed the greatest naval armada the world had ever seen. On one side, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Japanese mobile fleet, desperate to halt the American invasion of Saipan. On the other, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, shielded by Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 900 aircraft, and a latticework of radar and gunnery screens. By noon, these forces would collide in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa's plan called for overwhelming American defenses with massed waves of carrier aircraft. He launched 4 major strikes over the course of the day, nearly 400 planes in total, Zeros, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, many flown by inexperienced pilots. In theory, numbers and surprise might overwhelm the Americans. But in practice, American radar and disciplined fighter direction gave Mitcher a decisive edge. At 10 a.m., the first wave appeared on scopes, 70 miles out, 100 aircraft inbound. Within minutes, hundreds of Hellcats roared off the decks of Essex, Hornet, Yorktown, and the rest of Task Force 58. Air Group 15, McCampbell's command, scrambled in tight formations, climbing to intercept. Radar controllers aboard the carriers vectored the fighters with uncanny precision. Bandits, Angels 12, bearing 320, came the orders. Pilots adjusted course, throttled forward, and prepared to meet the enemy head-on. In total, more than 200 sorties were launched that morning, forming what one pilot later described as a solid wall of blue Hellcats between the Japanese and our carriers. The doctrine was simple. Keep the Japanese away from the fleet. If they reached the carriers, the invasion of Saipan would be at risk. If they were destroyed in the sky, American dominance would be secured. David McCampbell led VF-15 into the maelstrom. In his after-action report, he described the moment when the formations closed. "We spotted the enemy at 12 o'clock high. They broke to attack, but their dives were uncoordinated. We climbed through them and opened fire." McCampbell's Hellcat snarled into the first group of Zeros. With the discipline he demanded of his men, he fired short, controlled bursts, deflecting his shots into cockpits and wing roots. One Zero blossomed into flame. Seconds later, another spiraled down trailing smoke. He broke, rolled, and found a torpedo bomber wallowing below him. A quick burst tore its wing apart. By the end of the first day, McCampbell recorded 5 confirmed kills, a tally that placed him among the leading aces of the battle. What unfolded was unlike anything seen before in the Pacific. American pilots described the skies filled with burning aircraft, parachutes, and wreckage. "It was like shooting clay pigeons," one Hellcat pilot remarked, the phrase that would become the battle's enduring nickname. The contrast was stark. Japanese formations broke apart almost as soon as they encountered resistance. Inexperienced flyers pressed shallow dives, missed torpedo runs, or panicked when met by disciplined American gunnery. Debriefing reports painted a picture of slaughter. One Hellcat division alone claimed 15 kills in less than 10 minutes. Another pilot recalled, "The sky seemed alive with fire. Everywhere you looked, planes were exploding or spinning down. It stopped being combat and became execution." A handful of Japanese aircraft broke through the Hellcat screen. Anti-aircraft guns from cruisers and battleships opened up, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. Some attackers pressed home near suicidal dives, plunging toward carriers in what looked like the precursors to kamikaze tactics. But the Americans were ready. Not a single fleet carrier was lost. Only a few ships suffered minor damage. By contrast, the Japanese waves were virtually annihilated. Lieutenant J.G. George Carr, one of McCampbell's pilots, described the scene that evening. You could see smoke on the horizon where they went down. It was endless. Everywhere you looked, another enemy aircraft was in flames. We never dreamed it could be so one-sided. McCampbell himself remained calm in his report. He credited radar vectors, disciplined formations, and the Hellcats' superior performance. Yet his own actions, 5 kills in a single day, revealed the mastery of gunnery and composure under fire that defined his leadership. His example inspired his men to trust their training and their machines. By nightfall on June 19th, the Japanese had lost more than 250 aircraft. American losses were fewer than 30 fighters. The balance of naval air power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. For the Japanese, the carrier decks of Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho were nearly bare. For the Americans, Task Force 58 remained intact, its pilots bloodied but unbroken. On the USS Essex, McCampbell walked the ready rooms after the debriefings, speaking quietly to his pilots, congratulating some, consoling others. The message was clear. Discipline, teamwork, and the Hellcat had carried the day. The first act of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was over, but more remained to be done. The Japanese still had carriers afloat, and Spruance's cautious approach would be tested against Mitch's aggressive instinct. The first day of battle did more than destroy planes. It destroyed Japan's ability to fight a carrier war. The veteran pilots lost that day could never be replaced. Those who survived faced Americans who had tasted victory on an unprecedented scale. The phrase, "turkey shoot," captured the one-sidedness, but beneath it lay years of training, technological superiority, and leaders like McCampbell who turned potential into lethal efficiency. As darkness settled over the Philippine Sea, the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft drifted on the waves. The carriers of Task Force 58 steamed on, their flight decks busy with recovery and refueling, their pilots writing reports by red light. Among them, David McCampbell prepared for another day. The decisive moment of his career was still to come. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a clash of fleets. It was a contest of aerial doctrine, where tactics refined through years of combat training met outdated habits born in an earlier war. At the heart of that transformation stood David McCampbell, whose cool precision and disciplined approach to air combat made him the exemplar of the new American way of fighting in the Pacific. McCampbell's philosophy of aerial combat rested on energy. The F6F Hellcat was heavier and less nimble than the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 in a turning dogfight, but it had the advantages of speed, dive performance, and ruggedness. McCampbell drilled his squadron to never fight the Zero on its own terms. Instead, they would fight vertically, diving with the sun at their backs, striking hard, and climbing away to regain altitude. This boom and zoom style mirrored what the US Army Air Forces were perfecting in Europe with the P-38 and P-47. In both theatres, Americans learned that energy fighting, entering the engagement with speed and height, was the great equalizer against nimble but fragile adversaries. Japanese pilots, many of them newly trained and lacking combat seasoning, still relied on tight horizontal maneuvers. Their Zeros could outturn almost any opponent, but against disciplined Hellcat squadrons fighting in pairs and divisions, the tactic became suicidal. McCampbell was a marksman first and foremost. He forbade his men from spraying long bursts of .50 caliber fire. "Short bursts, steady aim," he repeated in briefings. Deflection shooting, aiming ahead of a moving target so the stream of bullets met the aircraft at its future position, was the key. Debriefing reports from the 13th Fighter Command repeatedly note McCampbell's emphasis on this technique. He urged pilots to practice at ranges between 200 and 400 yards, where the Hellcat's 6 Brownings created a dense cone of fire. The result was devastating efficiency. fewer rounds expended, more confirmed kills, and less risk of running dry in the middle of combat. As Air Group Commander, McCampbell's responsibility extended beyond his own kills. He orchestrated the rotations of Combat Air Patrol, CAP, over the fleet, ensuring that fresh divisions of fighters were always aloft to meet incoming raids. On June 19th, when wave after wave of Japanese aircraft probed toward Task Force 58, McCampbell coordinated intercepts so that divisions launched in succession, striking enemy formations before they reached torpedo release range. He refused to allow his pilots to be drawn into exhausting pursuits. Fuel and ammunition conservation mattered more than adding a few more claims to the tally. His standing order was clear: do not chase stragglers. A single zero fleeing at wave-top level might be tempting, but it was a trap for the undisciplined. Pilots who gave chase risked fuel starvation, separation from their divisions, or even an ambush by trailing fighters. McCampbell's control ensured that VF-15 remained cohesive throughout the day, a disciplined blade rather than a scattering of lone hunters. One dogfight, reconstructed from reports, reveals the method. At 10:36 a.m., a group of Japanese D-4Y dive bombers approached from the west, covered by Zeros at 14,000 feet. McCampbell led a division to intercept. He ordered his wingmen to hold formation, then dove through the escort screen, opening fire on a bomber's wing route. The aircraft burst into flames. Without circling, McCampbell pulled back into a climb, conserving energy. His wingmen followed, picking off stragglers as they rose again. A second engagement later that afternoon followed the same pattern. Japanese torpedo planes attempted to break through at low level. McCampbell positioned his division high, dove in pairs, and shredded the formation before it could release. Reports noted that no torpedoes struck home. The after-action summaries highlight McCampbell's focus on discipline. He praised pilots who held formation and fired in measured bursts. He chastised those who wasted ammunition or burned excess fuel in fruitless chases. His message was consistent. Victory lay in teamwork, not individual glory. This attitude set him apart from some earlier American aces, who often racked up kills by breaking formation. McCampbell, by contrast, balanced his personal combat success with the larger responsibility of keeping Air Group 15 intact. It was this philosophy that allowed him to score heavily himself while preserving the strength of his unit. By the end of June 19th, U.S. Navy fighter pilots claimed more than 350 kills. The Japanese lost at least 250 aircraft that day, according to both U.S. reports and later Japanese records. McCampbell himself was credited with 5 confirmed victories. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and captured Japanese war diaries confirmed that American claims were broadly accurate, though some engagements inevitably led to duplicate claims. The disparity between losses was staggering. American kill-to-loss ratios often exceeded 10-1, a testament to radar direction, Hellcat performance, and tactical discipline. McCampbell embodied all three. His squadrons not only intercepted the Japanese but returned in good order, ready for the next strike. The anatomy of McCampbell's dogfighting style revealed the maturing of U.S. naval aviation. No longer the desperate defensive fighting of 1942, no longer the learning curve of Guadalcanal. By 1944, it was a professional, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient system. McCampbell's insistence on marksmanship, energy tactics, and coordinated cap rotations exemplified this evolution. For the Japanese, the contrast was fatal. Their reliance on outdated maneuver doctrine and undertrained pilots could not withstand the industrially trained, tactically coordinated, and technologically superior American fighters. For McCampbell, June 1944 was only the beginning. His mastery of aerial combat, coupled with his measured leadership, would soon propel him to even greater achievements, including the legendary single-day tally that would etch his name forever into naval aviation history. The morning of June 20th dawned over an empty sea. The Japanese fleet, battered by the loss of hundreds of aircraft the previous day, had withdrawn westward. For Admiral Raymond Spruance and his Fifth Fleet, the decision loomed: pursue or hold back. Spruance, ever cautious, prioritized the protection of the amphibious forces landing on Saipan. But Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, argued for one more hammer blow. The Japanese fleet had retreated, but it had not escaped. At 1540, reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the enemy fleet 275 miles west of the American carriers. To launch a strike at that distance meant one thing: the pilots would have to fight their way back at night, a nightmare scenario in carrier aviation. Night carrier landings had never been attempted on this scale, but Mitcher believed the risk worth taking. If the Japanese carriers could be crippled, the heart of their naval air arm would be finished. Mitcher turned to his staff. "Launch the strike," he ordered. The gamble would be remembered as one of the boldest decisions in naval aviation history, the beginning of the mission beyond darkness. David McCampbell, as Commander Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, faced the daunting task of coordinating his squadrons for the long-range mission. He oversaw the launch of fighters, dive bombers and torpedo planes, parceling out assignments against expected targets. Fuel discipline was paramount. Every pilot was reminded: no unnecessary maneuvers, no prolonged dogfights. Get in, strike, and get out. McCampbell's own Hellcat remained on the flight deck. As CAG, his responsibility was to oversee the broader orchestration, not chase personal victories. He watched as Air Group 15th thundered off the deck into the late afternoon sun, part of a strike force of over 200 aircraft racing westward across the Philippine Sea. The Japanese fleet, already weakened, was about to suffer its death blow. Earlier in the day, US submarines had stalked and struck. USS Kavala torpedoed the fleet carrier Shokaku, sending her to the bottom in a series of thunderous explosions. USS Albacore had hit the pride of the Japanese fleet, Taiho, whose design boasted an armoured flight deck. Initially, she seemed to survive, but fumes from leaking gasoline spread through her ventilation system. Hours later, a catastrophic internal explosion ripped her apart. By the time Mitcher's late strike arrived, Japanese flight decks were already diminished. The air groups launched from Zuikaku, and the remaining carriers were pitiful compared to the swarms of the previous day. US dive bombers scored hits on oilers and escorting cruisers, and while the results of the dusk attack were less decisive than the submarine strikes, the cumulative effect was devastating. The Imperial Navy's carrier force was crippled beyond repair. For the American aviators, the return was the true test. As the horizon darkened, the strike groups turned east. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. One by one, pilots realized they would never make the carriers. Dozens ditched at sea, splashing into the waves in the fading light. McCampbell, monitoring reports aboard Essex, coordinated recovery plans. Destroyers were vectored to pick up downed pilots. Every aviator rescued was a victory equal to a kill in combat. Then came the most dangerous moment: the landings. Mitcher, recognizing the risk of disaster as exhausted pilots approached darkened decks, gave an unprecedented order. "Turn on the lights." Carriers lit their flight decks with floodlamps. Signal crews set out rows of burning barrels to mark approaches. The entire task force blazed against the night, a beacon visible for miles, even to submarines. It was a calculated risk, but it saved lives. Eyewitnesses never forgot the sight. Lieutenant, junior grade, John Bridges later recalled, "It was like landing on a Christmas tree in the middle of the Pacific. The flames from the barrels whipped in the wind, the decks glowed white, and we came in one after another praying our wheels would catch the wire." McCampbell's voice over the radio was calm, steady, and measured. He guided stragglers, reassured those who feared their tanks were dry, and coordinated with destroyers to home in on emergency flares from pilots forced into the sea. His leadership ensured that Air Group 15 suffered minimal losses despite the near-impossible conditions. By dawn, the tally was clear. The US had lost over 80 aircraft to fuel exhaustion, darkness, and ditching. Yet nearly all the pilots were rescued, thanks to the destroyer pickets and the lights Mitcher had risked turning on. In exchange, the Japanese had lost 2 of their finest carriers and the better part of their remaining naval air arm. Historians would later judge June 20th as the finishing blow to Japanese carrier aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered for its turkey shoot on June 19th and its mission beyond darkness on June 20th, destroyed Japan's to contest American naval air superiority. For McCampbell, it was another demonstration of what disciplined air leadership could accomplish. He had not fired his guns that evening, but his influence was everywhere, in the precision of Air Group 15's strike, in the orderly recovery of its pilots, and in the professionalism that turned a desperate gamble into a decisive victory. The legend of David McCampbell was still building. Greater triumphs lay ahead, but in the Philippine Sea, his calm hand had already left its mark on history. The smoke of battle had scarcely cleared from the skies over the Philippine Sea before its meaning became evident. The clash fought on June 19th to 20th. 1944 was not just another fleet action. It was the death knell of Japanese carrier aviation, the irreversible turning point that left the Imperial Navy stripped of its striking arm. For David McCampbell and Air Group 15, it was also the crucible in which reputations were forged and legacies secured. The numbers told a brutal story. By the close of June 20th, Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers, Shokaku, Taiho, and Hiyo, to the combined efforts of American submarines and carrier aircraft. More catastrophic still was the destruction of Japan's carrier air groups. Roughly 600 aircraft were lost in 2 days, along with hundreds of trained aviators. Unlike the United States, which had a vast pipeline of new pilots graduating every month, Japan could not replace such losses. The veteran flyers who had once terrorized the Pacific skies, men hardened at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, were largely gone, either killed or already buried in earlier campaigns. Their replacements, rushed through accelerated training programs, lacked the skill and cohesion to challenge disciplined American units flying superior aircraft. American casualties were remarkably light by comparison. Roughly 130 aircraft were lost, most not to enemy fire but to the perils of Mitcher's daring June 20th strike, fuel exhaustion, night ditchings, and hazardous recoveries in darkness. Nearly all the downed aviators were rescued by destroyers and lifeguard submarines. The cost was tragic for the individuals involved, but strategically negligible compared to the devastation inflicted on the enemy. The contrast underscored the widening gulf between the two navies. American carrier aviation had matured into a coordinated machine, radar-directed fighter control, disciplined combat air patrols, well-drilled strike packages, and a deep logistical tail to sustain operations. Japan, by contrast, faced the twilight of its naval air arm. For Commander David McCampbell, the battle was both a test and a revelation. Personally, he was credited with 7 confirmed victories during the 2 days, 5 on June 19th and 2 more during subsequent sorties. These victories, combined with his leadership of Air Group 15, cemented his reputation as a master of aerial combat and as a steady hand in the chaos of battle. The Philippine Sea set McCampbell on a trajectory that would soon make him the U.S. Navy's all-time leading ace. By the war's end, he would tally 34 confirmed aerial victories, a record unmatched in naval aviation. Yet even in June 1944, his calm leadership and marksmanship were already the stuff of legend within the fleet. The deeper legacy of the battle was strategic. After the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again attempted a large-scale carrier strike. The carriers that survived were reduced to hollow shells, their flight decks empty or filled with green pilots flying obsolete machines. When Japan launched its last great gamble at Leyte Gulf 4 months later, Its carriers were used not as offensive weapons, but as bait, decoys intended to lure American forces away from the true battle. The age of the Japanese carrier fleet, the weapon that had once dominated the Pacific, was over. From this point forward, the U.S. Navy would command the skies unopposed. McCampbell's own recognition came swiftly. His Medal of Honor citation, awarded later in the war, praised not only his personal courage, but his leadership of Air Group 15 during the Marianas Campaign. The citation noted his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. For the men who served under him, the words rang true. McCampbell was not only a deadly ace, but also a commander who placed the survival and effectiveness of his group above personal glory. His steady voice on the radio, his refusal to let pilots waste fuel or ammunition, and his meticulous attention to gunnery discipline made him the embodiment of professional naval aviation. In the decades that followed, the Battle of the Philippine Sea came to symbolize the industrial and tactical supremacy of American naval air power. The term Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, coined by jubilant pilots to describe the lopsided slaughter of Japanese aircraft, entered the lexicon of history. And within that victory, McCampbell's figure loomed large, the cool, disciplined ace who exemplified everything the U.S. Navy had become by 1944. The battle was a watershed. For the Japanese, it was the end of a dream. For the Americans, it was proof that the doctrine, training, and machines forged over years of struggle had reached their pinnacle. And for David McCampbell, it was the beginning of his march into legend, the path that would make him not only a hero of the Marianas, but a symbol of naval aviation's triumph in the Pacific War. The guns of the Pacific War fell silent in August 1945, but the memories of those who had fought in its skies endured for a lifetime. David McCampbell, the quiet Floridian who had risen from junior officer to become the U.S. Navy's leading ace, carried the lessons of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot and the wider war into the post-war era. His life became a bridge between the crucible of combat and the peacetime transformation of American naval aviation. When the war ended, McCampbell was more than an ace. He was a symbol. Decorated with the Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, and the Distinguished Flying Cross, he stood as the very image of the professional aviator. Yet he never sought celebrity. After a brief tour on the public speaking circuit, he returned to the work of the service, holding staff positions, training commands, and later assignments within naval aviation development. The post-war Navy was changing. Jets were replacing propeller-driven fighters, angled decks and steam catapults were revolutionizing carrier operations, and radar and missiles were beginning to redefine air combat. McCampbell, though a hero of the piston engine age, became an advocate for adaptation. He understood that the lessons of the Hellcat were not bound to the machine itself, but to the principles it embodied: discipline, gunnery precision, teamwork, and the marriage of technology with tactics. He retired in 1964 as a captain, closing a career that spanned the rise of the carrier from a supporting weapon to the centerpiece of American sea power. For the Japanese, the reckoning came in the interrogations of 1945 to 46. Captured officers and surviving pilots were asked to explain the failures of Operation Ago and the disaster at the Philippine Sea. Their testimonies, preserved in Allied translator and interpreter section reports, carried a note of bewilderment. Many cited the Hellcat as a shock. It was not simply that the F6F outclassed the Zero in speed, durability, and firepower. It was that the Americans employed it with scientific precision. Radar-directed interceptions meant Japanese strike groups were met far from their targets, shredded before they could even sight the American carriers. One officer admitted, "We flew into a wall. The enemy always knew where we were. We could not reach them." Another acknowledged the attrition of experienced flyers. By 1944, Japan's carrier air arm was staffed largely by rookies, many with less than 100 hours of flight time. Against McCampbell's carefully drilled divisions, they were slaughtered. The interrogations reveal less bitterness than resignation. Japanese officers recognized that their nation had gambled on an offensive war it could not sustain, and that industrial disparity, as much as tactical defeat, doomed them. In 1962, American and Japanese veterans gathered for a joint symposium on aviation history. The tone was not accusatory but reflective, the war now 2 decades past. McCampbell, by then retired from active flying, met several of his former adversaries. Discussions turned again to the Marianas. Japanese veterans spoke candidly of the despair they felt as Hellcats tore through their formations. They admitted that by 1944 the Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had become obsolete, and that the lack of armour and self-sealing tanks turned every hit into an inferno. McCampbell, ever modest, downplayed his role. He emphasized the teamwork of his air group and the broader system that had placed radar, intelligence, logistics, and mass production in service of the fleet. Yet those in attendance knew that his 7 victories in the Marianas and his later feats, including 9 kills in a single mission at Leyte, were the product not only of systemic advantage but of individual mastery. The symposium closed with a toast. Former foes acknowledged each other's courage, bound by the common fraternity of those who had faced death in the cockpit. By 1985, 4 decades after the war, memory had softened, but the reverence for what had been achieved remained sharp. At a Pacific Theater veterans reunion in Hawaii, McCampbell was invited to recount his experiences. His voice, quieter now with age, still carried the calm precision of a commander. He spoke of the Hellcat not as a machine of glory, but as a tool, rugged, forgiving, designed for the carrier deck as much as for combat. He remembered the discipline he demanded of his men, short bursts of fire, energy fighting, never chasing stragglers. He remembered the glow of burning barrels on the night of June 20th, 1944, as pilots risked everything to land in the dark, and he remembered those who did not return. For the veterans gathered, his recollections were more than stories. They were the stitching of memory into myth, a reminder that their generation had fought not only battles, but a war for survival that reshaped the world. Today, McCampbell's F6F Hellcat is preserved in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum collection. Its blue-grey skin, scarred by service, still bears the row of victory markings that once adorned its fuselage. Visitors see not just an aircraft, but an artifact of transformation, the embodiment of American naval air supremacy in its most decisive form. The Hellcat stands as a reminder of what made the difference: rugged design, ease of maintenance, and sheer numbers. 12,275 built, a fleet that overwhelmed by weight as much as by performance. Each rivet tells the story of an industrial machine that could outproduce, outtrain, and outsustain any adversary. The Hellcat was not the fastest or the most glamorous fighter of the war, but it was the right aircraft at the right time, matched to the Navy's needs and the Pacific Theater's realities. Its 19-to-1 kill ratio spoke to more than just its firepower. It reflected a system in which radar guided fighters to intercepts, carriers launched waves with clockwork regularity, and pilots like McCampbell enforced discipline in the heat of combat. David McCampbell himself became more than an ace. He was a teacher, a commander, and ultimately a symbol of what American naval aviation represented: the marriage of individual skill with collective advantage. His 34 victories remain the highest tally of any Navy pilot, but his greater achievement was in demonstrating how a well-led air group could harness America's systemic strengths to achieve decisive victory. In the end, McCampbell's story was not only about air combat, it was about transformation. From the pre-war days of fragile biplanes to the jet age of the Cold War, he spanned eras. From a young officer surviving the sinking of USS Wasp in 1942 to the commander of the fabled 15 in 1944, he embodied resilience. And from the skies of the Marianas to the halls of the Smithsonian, he stood as both warrior and teacher, a man whose calm voice and steady leadership revealed the true strength of American air power. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not his final battle, nor his most famous mission, but it was the crucible in which the legend was forged. McCampbell's life after the war ensured that legend endured, not as boast or bravado, but as memory, myth, and transformation. The story of how one man and one machine came to symbolize a nation's mastery of the air and the sea.